Hey everybody, welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie. I'm so excited to have my good friend and colleague, Petrey, here with me today. Hi, Taylor.
Hi, good to be back.
It is so good to visit with you. We always have so much fun, and I fully anticipate that today's and next Monday's episode are both going to be just as fun as all of the other ones that we've done, because we're going to be talking about, I don't know, something that's a little bit of a hot topic right now. I called upon Taylor to come my way and visit with me about the Family Proclamation to the world. And I think when I was putting this together, it kind of occurred to me, like, why is this a topic that people are talking about? I think I'll throw my thoughts in and then I'm going to let you jump in, Taylor. I think part of it is this 30-year anniversary thing, which to me kind of seems a little funny because I don't know that like 30 years is a typical number of years where there is a big celebration for things, but that's okay. We can make new years up to celebrate things. And then I think the other one is the recent change of leadership in the church and how the new president of the church, Dallin Oaks, is a real lover of the proclamation to the family. And so I think there's been a lot of buzz about like what, if anything, is going to happen in terms of the proclamation getting a little bit more attention and airtime. And a little bit of this happened in our last general conference. And Taylor was somewhat involved in some writing and some commentary around that. And so I was like, you know what, let's come together and talk about this. So what did I miss, Taylor? Any other reason why you think we're having more conversation about this right now, 30 years later?
Well, I agree completely with all of the points that you made above, but I'll just add that, we've never really left an era of cultural controversies about gender and sexuality. The proclamation is born in a moment of cultural controversy about that, and that has continued. It's shifted and shaped over time in new ways. But, a major issue in the last election in last year was around trans rights and trans identity. And, we're seeing the kind of ongoing conversations as our society is becoming actually more polarized than than we have ever been as well. And these social issues continue to be one way that people kind of mark their identities. And so the proclamation has become a kind of shorthand in some ways for many Latter-day Saints as a sort of cultural stance opposing, what they see as a sort of liberal set of changes around these issues as well. So I think that it has become that identity marker in the current moment, in part because it's reflecting a broader set of cultural issues that we're all struggling to kind of talk about and deal with and understand too.
I love that. And you're actually giving us a little bit of a forecast of things to come, because Taylor and I are going to really go a lot deeper into this intersection between doctrine and culture and history and politics and how very interwoven they are. So that's forthcoming. And also, Taylor, what you just did there was set us up perfectly for what I wanted you to spend some time on today to sort of set the stage for this two-part conversation. So before we talk about some of the recent ways that Taylor has been involved in kind of creating some space for commentary around the proclamation to the family, I would like for you, Taylor, to kind of give us a bit of a broad, overarching, understanding of family proclamations. And for all you who have not partaken of his book, Tabernacles of Clay, this is where he goes deeply into this. And also, we did spend some time in a previous series together talking about this, but this is good enough that I really, really, really want Taylor to spend more time on it here, mainly because when he and I talked about this before, my mind was like blown at how this is sort of a cultural movement, not just a statement that the Quorum of the 12 Apostles sort of independently came up with in the 90s. Okay, so Taylor, set the stage here for this larger conversation by talking about how we are part of a cultural moment right there at the beginning of I guess before the 21st century or at the end of the 20th century.
Yeah. So, in a way, I'll start even a little bit earlier, which is the 1970s and early 1980s, with the rise of the religious right as a really powerful political force in American politics. This is where evangelicals, Latter-day Saints, and conservative Catholics kind of joined together to combat feminism and homosexuality, essentially. Pornography was a big issue that they were really concerned with at the time as well. But these three groups who previously did not really like each other, definitely didn't want to talk to each other, found common causes on a set of political issues that they could join together to, fight in the political arena, which was also a new thing that religious groups, especially conservative religious groups, had not really done. Liberal religious groups had done that in the civil rights era, of course, and in favor of civil rights. But we see really conservatives kind of coming together in this new era as a kind of anti-civil, not on issues of civil rights necessarily, occasionally, but mostly on issues of gender and sexuality that are kind of emerging in that time period. And so the church is really developing deep relationships in their battle against the Equal Rights Amendment during these years with many of these other conservative groups. And there's a lot of overlapping and sharing of ideas and resources and language to talk about these kinds of issues that we see emerging during these years. And one of the things that a lot of groups in the religious right are doing in the late 80s and in the early 90s and even in the later 90s is putting out position papers on family values. And they're kind of publishing these documents that say, like, here's what we believe the biblical view of the family is. And they're citing scripture and they're making their case. And sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter. The Danvers statement is one of the famous early ones, and it's just like a page advertisement in Christianity Today, and others are longer, like the Family Manifesto, which is, I think, six or 8 pages or so, and it goes into children's rights and all kinds of other issues. But they all kind of belong to a similar genre of these position papers that are making political arguments about the nature of the family as a biblical and religious value. And so when the church publishes the Family a Proclamation to the World in 1995, it's taking part in this broader set of conversations. It even looks like some of the other ones. It's giving some of the same language, some of the same verses. There are some distinctively LDS features to ours. It mentions heavenly parents, which is not something you see in others as well, right? But it's where Latter-day Saints are leaning into some of their distinctive doctrines about the family in order to make their case even stronger. But it ends with a political call. It says this is for, judges and politicians and people all around the world to sort of vote for policies that will protect the family. Again, it's kind of in that genre of a lot of these other documents. I will say here, and maybe you'll ask about this anyway, but I'm just going to say directly that I disagree with a lot of the kind of popular historiography of this, which is that the Proclamation on the Family was like a legal document that was necessary in order to fight same-sex marriage in Hawaii in the 1990s. Having done the research on this, I don't think that is true. That's not to say that the same-sex marriage debates in the 1990s in Hawaii did not influence the outcome of the proclamation. It absolutely did, but it wasn't necessary for the church to put out a legal document or anything like that, or a proclamation in order to make their legal case. They had plenty of other resources and tools to do that. You don't need a proclamation in order to fight against same-sex marriage. So I think that's an often a misunderstanding a little bit of this document. And so instead, I try to locate it in a little bit more broader context of these other family manifestos and family position papers that are coming out in conservative religious political circles at the time.
I'm super intrigued with the realization that I personally had that this wasn't, well, I'm going to expose for a second, like when I was very, very traditionally believing, it never would have even crossed my mind that this was part of a larger movement. And I guess I'm also thinking that I don't know that they would want the typical run-of-the-mill Latter-day Saint to think about it as if it were part of a larger Christian coalition, political, cultural statement of the times. Because my sense was when I was listening to it for the first time, and it was very significant for me because I was a missionary. That was my first general conference as a missionary. And so when, like, many a conference I don't have much of a memory of, but I do have a memory of this being read and having the sense that I think they probably wanted someone like me to have, which was this fell from the lips of God to the 12 apostles or whatever, and that this is a standalone declaration to the world about some unique, almost standalone truths. And then I actually learned, actually mostly from you, from the book that I read, from the Tabernacles of Clay, that this is actually a larger movement that's going on, that it is very, very much social, cultural, political in nature. Follow-up question to you, Taylor, is do you think, well, I'm thinking about two things. On the one hand, the statement itself, or the proclamation itself, talks about, it's almost like explicitly a political statement. And yet, on the other hand, I think that if someone were to ask an official person, their sense, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but the response would be resistance to this as a political statement. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's always a way in which those are blurry categories, and there's some, deniability that it's a political document, while at the same time, it's very obviously it is one. It says it is one at the very end. We warn society. Again, I'm not quoting directly here, but we warn societies that if you don't do this stuff, then biblical plagues are going to hit you or whatever, right? I mean, it's making a case not about Latter-day Saint doctrine exclusively, but it's to the world. And it's not just an invitation to come to Christ or anything like that. Again, it's an invitation to adopt these particular values on the family. And the church is very actively getting involved in politics in these years. It's already directly involved in the Hawaii battle during that time. They're really influential in passing the Defense of Marriage Act, which would prohibit states from recognizing same-sex marriages performed in other states, first in Utah, which then becomes a national law not long after that. And of course, the church gets involved in the UN and pushing, heterosexual family policies as a kind of global value as well during these years, and continues up until today to do that kind of work. So the church doesn't see this as an exclusively religious issue, which is only a matter for inside of its own walls. It is actively involved in trying to shape and change the world around it, especially through politics. No one can plausibly say that the church doesn't care about the political outcomes here, because they're actively involved in it and have been for the last 30 plus years.
It feels to me, perhaps, maybe that the church and churches in general like to think that they are shaping culture and politics, but not that they are also being shaped by culture and politics. That culture, inclusive of churches, we are co-creating ideas and meanings around all sorts of these topics. And this is just one of those larger conversations where the co-creation is going on between religious institutions, political institutions, families, schools, and whatnot. So you wrote an opinion piece for the Tribune that, I don't know if it was coincidental or not, but it dropped right before General Conference. Give us a little bit of a sense of what you were thinking in writing that. And we're going to go kind of deeper into this opinion piece today.
Yeah. So I was thinking about the 30th anniversary of the proclamation, and had thought, well, what could I write about it that I hadn't necessarily said before, maybe as a summary of some of the things that I'd said before, because as you mentioned, there I have a chapter on the history of the proclamation in Tabernacles of Clay. I have done some other analysis of the scriptural justifications that the proclamation makes in some of my other research in queering kinship in the Mormon cosmos. And there really are actually very few scholars who have written about the proclamation. There's for such an important document. I won't say not a lot of people have written. A lot of people have written a little bit about it, but there haven't been a lot of like deep analysis of it. So I was trying to think, well, what could I say? What's a kind of new perspective, or what's a way to kind of engage this? And so I wrote up this brief opinion piece trying to address the question of the genre of the proclamation. And proclamations are rare in LDS history. There have been 6 total. And they're not all the same. They're all quite different. Okay. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about that history of what those are. But, so the question is, well, what is then a proclamation? How does it situate itself? How does it fit into a broader set of things? And then what's the content of it as well? And how does that fit into the history of LDS teachings on gender and the family as well? And so I wanted to kind of address both of those questions of what the genre is and how the content sort of fits in with that genre. And so I thought, let me write up a little quick opinion piece on this. And, most people don't read opinion pieces, whatever. It's not, no one's going to care. No one's going to even notice anyway. But I thought this would be something important to do. So I wrote that piece, and it did just coincidentally happen to come out right before General Conference. I had written it, I think, a couple of weeks or a week and a half or so before that, and they scheduled it for then. So there were other stories that had happened that week, like or President Nelson passing away. There was a shooting in Michigan. There were a lot of things that were kind of going on. So it sort of got pushed off to then. And I don't know if that helped or hurt the the readership of it, but that's what happened.
Will you read the opinion piece for us so that those who have not read it or don't have access to the Tribune can kind of get a feel for what this is? And then we're going to really play with the ideas in there. And also I'm very interested in the response, because you have shared with me offline that there was a lot of response. So
yes, I will do both of those things. So let me read it. Let me read this really quickly. Well, I'll read it slowly for everyone.
there you go.
I'll read it now. The title is The LDS Church's Family Proclamation is Commentary, Not Revelation. On September 23rd, 1995, President Gordon B. Hinckley stood before the women of the Relief Society and unveiled what has since become one of the most cited, celebrated, and contested texts in modern Mormonism, the Family, a Proclamation to the World. It was only the 5th time in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that leaders had issued something called a proclamation. Before then, the genre was so little used and so little remembered that most Latter-day Saints couldn't name one. In fact, many of those earlier efforts are now curiosities at best. One proclamation from 1865 even demanded the complete destruction of Lucy Mack Smith's biography of her son, church founder Joseph Smith. Hardly a position the modern church maintains, given how her own book is now cited. That history raises an awkward but important question. What exactly is a proclamation? There has never been a clear answer. Unlike Scripture, proclamations aren't canonized. Unlike revelations, they don't claim to be divine communications. And they don't always reflect a consistent, timeless consensus that we might expect of doctrine. As Apostle Boyd K. Packer once called the 1995 text a revelation, but church editors later scrubbed that word from his printed remarks. Clearly, leaders themselves know the label is a little slippery. And yet the 1995 proclamation has endured in ways its predecessor proclamations never did, and its 2020 successor on the bicentennial of Joseph Smith's first vision has not. The family document hangs on living room walls, is recited in sacrament and general conference talks, has been quoted in countless legal briefs, has energized political campaigns across the globe, and divided the faithful. For many members, it isn't just a proclamation, it's the proclamation. The 1995 proclamation is considered doctrine by today's standards, presenting itself as timeless truth, even while its contents reflect the shifting sands of church history. In the 19th century, leaders preached plural marriage as central to God's plan. Up until the late 20th century, they believed marriage was between a man and a woman of the same race, refusing to allow some interracial marriages. The proclamation's idea of equal partnership between husbands and wives would have sounded foreign to most apostles before the 1970s. And gender as an eternal characteristic? President Joseph Fielding Smith would like a word. He consistently taught as doctrine that, quote, after the resurrection, there will be neither male or female sex for the vast majority of humanity. If the family proclamation is not revelation, not scripture, and not unchanging doctrine, then what is it? I'd argue it's best understood as commentary. That may sound underwhelming, but commentary is one of the oldest and most important genres in religion. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and more have long used commentary to interpret sacred texts for new times and circumstances. The 1995 proclamation does exactly that. It rereads Genesis 1 to 3 through the lens of late 20th century anxieties about feminism, same-sex marriage, and the breakdown of the traditional family structures. It also issues a warning that calamities will follow if its interpretation is ignored. Like other conservative religious contemporaries on family values, conservative commentaries on family values that became so popular in the 1980s and 1990s, the proclamation addresses the moment by appealing to timeless truths. Like all commentary, though, it doesn't end the conversation. It sparks new ones. In 2019, President Dallin H. Oaks clarified that the proclamation's use of gender means, quote, biological sex at birth. By 2022, the church reinterpreted the proclamation's political role no longer to block same-sex marriage in all of society, but rather to protect religious freedom for those who don't affirm it. In other words, the commentary has itself been re-commented upon. That's why understanding the proclamation as commentary matters. It frees us to see one moment in a larger, evolving debate about family, gender, and marriage in the Latter-day Saint tradition that reflects the values of its era. And it reminds us that every declaration, no matter how authoritative, is still an interpretation that someday could be reinterpreted again. 3 decades on, the Family Proclamation may loom larger than any of its predecessors, but history is always commentary upon commentary. How it will be remembered in the next 30 years remains to be seen.
Thank you. Such a good piece. Very well written and very articulate, and I really, really enjoyed reading it myself. So
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah. I would like to hear what other people thought, though. Talk us through that.
Well, a lot of people objected to a couple of parts of it. One is that they insisted very strongly that because it is considered doctrine today, that therefore this is also an unchanging doctrine. And so there's a kind of, ahistorical approach that many Latter-day Saints have towards this text, which see it as a consistently reflecting the consistent teachings of church leaders at all times and all places and so on. And where any church leader has taught something different from the proclamation, well, that was just their personal opinion at the time or whatever, right? And so its status as doctrine affects the way that many people understand the historical teachings of the church as well. The other part is that a lot of people objected to me calling it commentary, which they assumed meant therefore either not doctrinal or just commentary, and therefore has no authority or no value at all, And so I think there was still some confusion about what I meant by commentary and where I think commentary lies in the kind of ranking of authoritative speech of church leaders. And then I think the other big objection that people had to it was my claim that it was not revelation, which for many Latter-day Saints, the idea that, what church leaders are doing and saying is always directed by revelation is a really controlling and governing idea. So not defining it as revelation was, I think, another sticking point for a lot of people. And this became especially acute when the day after this was published in General Conference, Elder Rasband said that the text of the proclamation contains revelatory words, which many people understood to be a direct rebuttal to my statement that it was not revelation. And we can maybe unpack what the difference is between revelation and revelatory words and so on. But I think that the different ways of categorizing it and what the implications of those categories might mean is, again, part of what I was wading into and definitely where a lot of the controversy existed too.
So a couple of follow-up questions, and then yes, we are going to talk a little. I would love to go into some semantics questions because it does appear that, I don't know, accidentally or maybe not so much, I'm not so sure, but you did stumble into a little bit of a semantics, a complicated set of questions that were emerging because of the way words are valued and used and the hierarchy of different words. So we're going to go there in just a second. But before we do that, I'm very intrigued with the pushback, bearing in mind that this was the Salt Lake Tribune, and this might just be revealing again my ignorance isn't the Salt Lake Tribune crowd a rather liberal crowd when we are thinking in terms of Latter-day Saint interpretation, and think, help me through that. And I'm assuming you probably also had some support too. Yeah.
Well, yes, but liberals are not the only ones who read it. I've discovered that there's a favorite pastime of many conservative church members, which is hating the Salt Lake Tribune, which I didn't know. Okay, and so they find stuff that me or a handful of other people will write there as that are clearly marked as opinion pieces, and as evidence of like that the Salt Lake Tribune as a whole hates the church or something. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. It just happens to not be the Deseret News. That is, it is not owned by the church and is not governed by the editorial policies of the church itself. And so I think a lot of people confuse sometimes criticism with anti-Mormonism or something along those lines. But it was the controversy, I would say, mostly came from conservative church members, including very conservative church members in many cases, sort of the far right of the church that seem to get really upset about my piece. So, but again, lots of people loved it as well, and I think for many thinking Latter-day Saints, there's maybe a little to quibble about, and there are things that I would quibble about in my own piece. I have a follow-up that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But the sort of deep emotional freak out that we saw was maybe more characteristic of the far right themselves. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Good clarification. And, I have to share with you my own impression of the piece that you wrote. To me, it actually read as, how do I want to say this? As what I'm about ready to say is going to sound too strong, because I don't think of you as an apologetic, but it felt apologetic in nature because you were helping situate the proclamation in a way that allows it to be inconsistent, but that's okay. Meaning, you see, am I making sense to you that you were trying to help the proclamation itself be viable, albeit an inconsistent document when it comes to the changes that have happened historically in the church? Can you say that differently in a way that's a little clearer?
I think that's a really, again, apologetic might be a too strong of a word there, but I'm attempting to be explanatory. I'm attempting to say, here's something. Let's try to explain how this works within this religious context, right? This has not been, these teachings have not been consistently taught. That doesn't mean they're not true or they're not important or that they aren't doctrines for the church, but we have to reckon with that, right? And it's also true that the document has been reinterpreted in the modern period as well. What Gordon B. Hinckley thought that the proclamation meant with respect to same-sex marriage in 1995 is not what the church taught in 2022 when they approved the federal law that protected same-sex marriage in exchange for greater religious freedoms for institutions, right? And that's not what the proclamation says either. The proclamation warns societies that if they do allow this kind of stuff, then we're going to have serious troubles, right? So the proclamation is being reinterpreted now, and that's a normal thing. That's how religious communities work, is they take what's done in the past and they reinterpret it and apply it to new contexts and new situations and see how it can happen, how we can maybe make that compromise here, or we need to lean into this a little bit more, and so on. And so I'm trying to do my best to explain how that process works through the genre of commentary as itself a practice of reinterpretation.
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification, and for even helping clarify what I'm trying to say and what I felt, which is that this is not a piece by a critic who is trying to be harmful towards the church or even the document itself. You're trying to situate the doctrine in a culture that is inevitably going to be changing as time goes by, and that the document, by your definition as commentary, is allowed to evolve and shift and change as we continue to reinterpret what's going on through the lens of, in this particular case, gender and sexuality. Okay, so even though that was what your intent was, and that's what some of us read. Clearly, the way you framed it was a trigger point for a lot of people. And I think this is a good place to move over to words.
Well,
To
maybe, but let
Okay.
me say one last thing about that too, which is that, and I think that maybe the words will help us to understand this point too, which is that, we have a tension within the church between this concept of eternal truths and continuing revelation. And we can kind of like activate those two, things of like, this will never change. And yeah, that can change, right? As a way of sort of accommodating that process of evolving, of developing, of change in the church. And it's a way of sort of both preserving the things that we think are really important, and a way of letting go of the things that we don't, and changing them. And so, for many people between those two extremes, the proclamation fits solidly in the eternal truths column of things, right? And so my piece is calling that into question, both because of the historical teachings of the church prior to it, right? And even the interpretations that the church has offered of this document since it as well. And so I'm attempting to sort of account for that by maybe shifting it a little bit more into that category of texts and things which can be interpreted and can evolve, and sort of where continuing revelation lies, right? To sort of shift it into that. And that makes people uncomfortable. And I want to accept that that's the case as well, and not deny that I'm not also, yeah, I'm challenging a certain belief here in the authority of this document, but doing so based on the tradition itself, right? Rather than saying, oh, it's not true because of feminism is true or something like that. I'm saying, no, actually, the church itself has changed on this issue and continues to change on this issue. And that is a clue for how it is that it may continue to change on this issue, because change is inevitable. Change always happens, right? Any historian will tell you that. So I as a historian, I feel an obligation to say, like, yeah, stuff is going to change. It does. So yeah.
You're actually trying to help the church reckon with reality. And in so doing, you introduced a different word. And I think that was, at least in part, the piece that got a lot of people very, very nervous. And
Yeah.
I think it's because in Mormonism, especially in very like conservative Mormonism, revelation kind of holds a space that nobody really is allowed to touch. And so what you're saying is, if we're leaning into this idea that this was revelation, and if revelation means unchanging, then we've got to have a conversation about this, because in our own lifetimes, not to mention all the things that happened before, the last several decades, things have changed. But you pointed to a few things even as recent as 2015, right? That they are changing. And so you're basically saying, okay, so we either need to change the definition of revelation, or we could call it something else altogether. And then when you moved into I think it's more of a scholarly conversation, where it sounds to me like, and maybe this is where you can speak into this a little bit more, is my sense is you were not intending to be belittling or degrading of like downgrading this from revelation to commentary. You were simply changing, like almost like a lateral change from like revelation to commentary, so that it could fit reality of what the document is and what it does and what its role is as a society or a church is, constructing and interpreting itself as time goes by. And then when you hit this commentary word, it really set people off, because it felt like it was almost a personal attack on an authoritarian institution, on its leadership, on its viability. Speak into that if you would.
Yeah, I think all of that, the sort of way that people might be triggered by any challenge to authority, or the way that this document kind of stands in for church authority, church leadership, church, legitimacy of church leaders to interpret doctrine, right? All of those things are kind of bundled up together in a way where, even as I'm trying to carefully walk around those things, people are going to get tripped up on them a little bit. And at points, I think, already to what I said earlier, that we have these like two modes of, this is we have other language for it. Policy on the one hand, which is changeable and interpreting, and you can be reinterpreted, and doctrine on the other hand, which can't be, right? Or revelation versus eternal, continuing revelation, and so we have all of these ways of kind of like putting things into these two buckets, right? And in part, I want to show that those two buckets are insufficient in a lot of ways, that they're inconsistent in a lot of ways, at least from a scholarly perspective, and that they are selectively applied over time, And I'll give one example of this that's, I think closely related. In November 2015, church leaders issued a new policy on the children of same-sex married couples and whether or not they could be baptized, what kind of restrictions were put on their membership, what kinds of things would make them eligible for serving in church callings, including missions and so on. And immediately, everyone will remember this caused a huge backlash, a lot of uproar. It seemed cruel. It seemed, unjust in a number of ways. And very soon after that, Elder Christofferson comes out and gives a whole interview. Here's why we were trying to do this, and here's our intention, and so on, attempts to sort of deflate it. And not long after that, Elder Nelson came out and said that this was a revelation. And it really caught a lot of people off guard because it very clearly seemed to be in the policy category of things, right? People had been same-sex married in the United States in several states long before this policy ever came out, right? Why now? Obviously it was right after the Supreme Court decision and became a national policy. But there were a lot of questions. Why are you getting this revelation right now? And it really seemed to throw a lot of people off of like, oh, policies are also revelations and so on. And then, of course, 4 years later, President Nelson now rescinds the policy and puts it back to what it was before. I'm trying to remember the exact sequence of events, but either he or somebody right after that is like, the policies that we do, including the changes, are guided by revelation. Something along like that. So revelation is both the explanation for the policy and the explanation for pulling it away, right? Which again seems to suggest that maybe revelation is a little bit more of a slippery category than we might think, and that different church leaders might understand its meaning differently. And interrelated to this, and it was one of my kind of main points that I made here, is that Elder Packer had called the proclamation a revelation once in General Conference, and it was the first. It also made a lot of news. It was in conjunction with some other controversial statements that he had made in that particular talk. But when the published version came out a week later, that word was removed. It had been edited, and church leaders occasionally will edit their talks, sometimes when they speak on controversial topics, and but that seemed to be for a lot of people of like definitively the church does not want to call this a revelation, and in part that's because they had never done that before. The text does not introduce itself as a revelation. The process by which it comes about was not described as a revelation necessarily. And so I felt on pretty firm ground by saying it's not a revelation when I wrote of the time that I wrote my piece, because church leaders had never said it was a revelation. And the one time they did, they changed it, right? And so I think that one of the things that I was kind of trying to rely on is that revelation did have a little bit more of a fixed, definitive meaning in the church. And I referred to it as divine communication. That is where, Joseph Smith gets his revelations or visions and things along those lines. But I don't know if I'm convinced by that definition of revelation anymore. and wasn't not even sure if I really was convinced of it by then, but I was trying to sort of define it in that more narrow way there, that I think that some church leaders at least had also tried to define it that way as well. But as we see, people like President Nelson maybe used it in slightly more expansive ways. And maybe Elder Rasband is using it in a slightly more expansive way as well. And it's in part because we don't really have a fixed set of criteria for defining what is and what isn't revelation.
This topic becomes more and more interesting the more I think about it, because a couple things as we head to the end of this episode and set everyone up for next Monday's episode is these words, not only do they seem to be shifting in their meaning depending on who's saying them and when they're being said, there seems to be some realization that they're powerful words because sometimes they are actually scrubbed from certain speeches because of the implications of calling something doctrine or revelation. And therefore it's fascinating because it does seem in some ways like there's an instability of meaning in these words, and yet at the same time, from the perspective of the constituency of the church, one thing seems clear is that we're not to talk about it or contest it when it is spoken of as if it were revelation or doctrine, even though the definitions of those seems to change. Am I capturing the confusion of this? Like why this is so complicated?
I think so. And it's not necessarily that I would say that there's a prohibition coming from church leaders about not talking about it, right? But that we don't have a very clear taxonomy of like levels of authority, right? And that different church leaders have had wildly different understandings of this. For some, it's every word that's spoken in general conference. For some, it's every word that they speak at all. For others, it's, what dreams they had at night. I mean, the elder or President Nelson would talk a lot about, he was getting revelation all night, every time he would go to bed, and he'd have to get up and write down his revelations, right? And we even know many Latter-day Saints who hold to that very expansive understanding that, I was in the grocery store and I prayed what I should make for dinner for my family tonight, and the Lord told me to buy pasta, so I did, right? And so there are some people who live very, very closely in that world of like where divine communication is happening all the time, right? And other members of the church and leaders of the church have a more selective understanding, is that, revelation is something which is special, which is sacred. And when it does happen, we don't talk about it very much at all, right? It's a much more distinctive experience than maybe just being led by the Holy Ghost or, other kinds of promptings or impressions that we might have. And so I think that like even within our culture, from the very top levels to what we hear in our fast and testimony meetings, we'll see a wide range of understandings of like what divine communication consists of and the level of authority that we ascribe to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's doctrine versus commentary, and that seems to be there's a clear hierarchy, at least. And some people feel like commentary is a demotion, right?
Yeah.
Revelation versus commentary. Again, you don't want to be in the commentary department if you're in an authoritarian church, right? That means that whatever you're saying has lost status. And then proclamation versus doctrine, even that is pretty slippery because sometimes proclamation is interpreted to be doctrinal and sometimes maybe not so much. And then I guess the one thing I would say in response to what you were just saying is it feels to me as if while the definition of revelation seems to be variable informally, it feels, and maybe you can push back if you so desire, it feels to me that if from the perspective of the leadership, if they are speaking in terms of doctrine or revelation, that kind of does sort of carry with it a sense of, how do I want to say this? Thus saith the Lord. Like there is no commentary, there's no dialogue, there's no questioning until, or if and until we change our mind, and then you don't question that either. So there's a variability that's built into it, but it's really very much unilateral. Mm-hmm. Does that feel like, I guess I'm just trying to like speak into the complexity of it, but also how in some ways it's inconsistent too. And I think that's perhaps why this document itself has been in some ways kind of a fun sandbox to like have these conversations, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And, why I think this remains an enduring question of like, well, how do we think of the authoritative status of these kinds of things, right? And this goes back because we have all kinds of ways of talking about even scripture, right? We have in the Articles of Faith, the Bible is the word of God as far as it is translated correctly. There's a caveat there, right? Where we're not really bound by everything there, And so we have all of these tools or mechanisms or resources that we can use to sort of bump up or downgrade the authority of any particular teaching at any particular moment, right? And I'm doing my best to sort of try to make sense of that and make sense of these categories as internally to them. But you're especially right to note that commentary is not one of those that is recognized among Latter-day Saints as an authoritative category.
Right.
And so and I think that that's one of the challenges that my piece faced a little bit too, is that it was like, well, what is commentary? And I think that one of the other pieces that you said that I want to circle back to that I think really helps to make sense of what's at stake here is when you said like the thus saith the Lord element of it, right? There's a way in which removing the humanity, removing the history, removing the contingency of the speaker by being able to say, well, God told me to say this, right? Is a long authoritative technique in religious traditions. The Bible made me do it. Joseph Smith told me to do it, whatever, right? Whatever it is that we can sort of say, or God told me directly through revelation, right? Whatever we can do to sort of remove ourselves as the conduit of that divine message and say it is purely divine, is something that I think our church leadership really relies heavily on, right? And so to want to reintroduce the human, the historical, the contingent, the individual as a way of understanding how those messages are communicated is, it is a new way of approaching this that I think is a little bit destabilizing for some people, but I think ultimately a better one and a stronger one, not only from an academic perspective, but I think ultimately a more healthy religious perspective as well. But yeah, I think that that's a lot of what's at stake.
Yeah, so you are actually doing a beautiful job of sort of setting us up for what we're going to talk about next week, because the conversation that we're having really, I think, speaks into some very interesting ways to think about doctrine. And in our next episode, you're going to actually talk a little bit about a follow-up to your opinion piece that I think you just published on your Facebook page. So this is probably less well known, but it really does a good job of sort of talking into or speaking into why is it that you think this is an important conversation to be having to help the church confront itself on some inconsistencies that are quite glaring for quite a few people that are really interested in looking at theology, how the doctrine is formed, how it's defined, and also the history, right? And so as inconvenient, or I don't know, like downgrading something from doctrine to commentary, I don't think is a downgrade, because what you're actually doing is you're positioning the statement in a way that allows it to maintain some sort of allowable inconsistencies. And our next conversation is actually going to talk about that, because as inconvenient as therapists and scholars are to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we really care about how sustainable the church is to thinking, feeling, growing, evolving human beings. And therefore, we need to be having these challenging conversations when something comes up that has inconsistencies fairly significantly like highlighted. And I think this is a really important conversation for this. Last thing I want to say before we close, and I want to hear from you, Taylor, is just to set you all up for something else I'm going to be talking to Taylor about next week. Is I'm interested in how common these sorts of problems are anywhere other than in an authoritarian institution. Because to me, what really came up for me as I was reading Taylor's piece and then the general conference talk and then Taylor's follow-up piece is that I think these problems emerge when an institution basically says, it is so because I say it is so. And it kind of sort of curtails any kind of dialogue or any kind of conversation that invites accountability or invites definition of terms or invites the confrontation with history. And when those things come up and it's authoritarian and the institution is authoritarian in nature, rather than wanting to confront those things, instead they try to shut things down. And I'm interested in having our talking about that. Anything you want to say to sort of respond to that, or at least, I mean, we're going into it deeper next time, but that's just kind of something I'm very interested in talking about next time.
Yeah. Well, I haven't, fortunately, I haven't had the circumstances where the church has tried to shut me down. I know you have, and others have, right? And so I can't speak directly to that part necessarily, but I agree that the question of authority is one of the most pressing, I'll say social questions, but especially religious questions that I think people face, right? I say it's this, you say it's that. How do we reconcile here, right? How do we come to a decision about what to do when there's disagreement and so on, right? So actually having some structure of authority is a helpful thing, right? But obviously that authority can also be abused. That authority can err in a number of ways as well. And so creating space for dialogue, creating space for dissent, creating space for disagreement or reinterpretation is, I think, essential for any community also, and especially a religious community, to be able to kind of navigate some of those tricky issues.
All right, y'all, more to come on this conversation next time. I had a follow-up for you, Taylor, but then we would just be actually going into the next conversation now. So
all right, we'll save it.
We'll save it for next time. Thank you all so much for being here, and we will see you all next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. Your support for this podcast is extremely valuable to us. If Valerie's work has made an impact in your life, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review. For info on webinars, classes, support groups, and live events, click the link in today's show notes or visit our website at latterdaystruggles.com. Latter-day Struggles is a proud member of the Dialogue Podcasting Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.